Started. Hi, my name is Stefani Bachetti. I'm a 2011 ID grad. I'm super excited to be here moderating this panel on design, data, and behavior greater than the sum of their parts. I think we all know the clear benefits of data-driven insights, and data is definitely here to stay, whether big data or I think it's little big data now as well. Behavioral economics have also become a great field for us to kind of borrow from to better understand, why people do what they do. And obviously, none of this would be worth anything without design incorporated into it. I think we can all agree. And so we're going to talk today a little bit about that. I'm going to let the panel kind of introduce themselves and let you know who they are and where they're from.
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Grand Studio. I am not an ID alumnus, but I am a friend of ID by virtue of hanging out at all these types of events. I actually have an art history background and found when I graduated that it wasn't going to be the moneymaker I thought it would be. So I taught myself how to code, and for about 10 years in New York, I was a developer. I worked at places like museums, doing digital interactives and sort of interpretive strategy. And then I joined a company called Moment. Moment was a company founded by an ID alumnus that had done digital product design for about 15 years. And I joined actually as Moment's only developer. And I found this amazing niche where I could apply some of my sort of points of view as a developer and my skills as a developer to these very, very user-centered design problems. And I sort of fell away from development and sort of fell into user experience design and design strategy. About 2 years ago, I moved here to Chicago to open up Moment Chicago. And then about 2 months ago, Moment New York got purchased by Verizon. And so I had this moment where I was talking to my former boss, the former CEO of Moment, and he sort of said, "Do you want to join or do you want to stay?" And so here I am. And for the last 2 months, we've made a company. Our work is very similar. I've had to learn how to process payroll and get people insurance and all that stuff. My life has been pretty different for the last 2 months, but that's what I've been doing.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Leifer, and I'm a vice president at Ideas 42. And I'll be bringing a little bit of a different lens, I think, to the conversation, since Ideas 42 is a nonprofit organization. We're about 100 behavioral scientists, so people who have been trained in psychology, behavioral economics, but also research methods. And what we do is translate the research insights from people who are studying human behavior and developing really amazing theories about how people make decisions, why they behave the way they do, and how the features of their environment and the lives that they're living really sort of drive those decisions and behaviors, and translating that through projects, through partnership. So most of the work I do these days is in health and healthcare, so thinking about how to help people build healthier habits, managing non-communicable diseases and chronic conditions like diabetes, and working also on the opioid crisis. So thinking about response and using those insights to build, well thought through solutions and taking a human-centered approach.
Hey, I'm Meghan Webster. I actually am an architect by training and still am an architect on paper, but I actually don't think any of my day job really represents what my parents think I do. Background in undergrad in architecture and graduate school as well. I work for Gensler and am the Firmwide education leader. So that doesn't mean that I teach people about education in the organization. It means that I lead the market sector for education. So higher education, K through 12, anything learning, whether that's corporate learning or anything in that spectrum. I think my job does, include some things that are more kind of characteristically about architecture. I, build ground up buildings, but Gensler is a design firm, I think, in kind of the big D sense of design. We don't have engineering, but we are the largest design firm, and we have architects, interior designers, but also graphic designers, analysts, and consultants. And so that really allows us to kind of approach problems, with sort of a 360 lens. So as much as I build buildings, I also do a lot of things that just involve people. So.
Great, thanks all of you. To get things rolling, it sounds like you all have kind of different experiences and different lenses to look at this. I'm just kind of curious about how within your organizations do you integrate design, data, and behavior? What does that look like, and what are some of the challenges that you come across in your organizations?
So, candidly, I think it's something we are not doing all that well. I have a very specific perspective on this problem as somebody that was a developer, and I kind of fell into the design practice at a key moment where mobile devices were suddenly a means, a mode of accessing information. And I had a point of view based on my skills and training as a developer that was useful, that the same sort of thought process about identifying sort of patterns of use and making sure that you're assigning those patterns where it matches behaviors, even in different places, was completely applicable to a pattern-centered design process, which is now basically the way that we do things. And I think we're in a moment in regards to data that is highly similar. I think we're looking for people that have technical expertise in data that can help us to bridge our human-centered design processes and this new thing that is inherently technical, to help us understand where we can step into these problems with a higher degree of sophistication than just saying we need to be more sensitive to data and we need to look to a data scientist to tell us what we can do with the data.
Yeah, I think we combine all three things at Ideas 42, but we do it in a bit of an interesting way where not all three are present at every point in our project process. I think we use both insights about human behavior and an understanding about what leads people to evaluate choices in a certain way, to follow through or not on the intentions that they have or the choices that they're making, to inform our understanding of the problem. And then we collect data, both through qualitative field research methods, by speaking to people, by observing them in their environment, through a lot of ethnographic style work, to try to understand how the environment is driving the problem that we're seeing. So as an example, if you're interested in the issue of retirement savings, people might say to you that they would like to save more for retirement, but they're not saving enough yet. And so you can gather lots of different information about why that might be the case from a theoretical perspective to inform your understanding of that problem. But then you would actually want to go out into the real world and talk to real people and say, what is it that you are interested in saving for? What makes it hard to save? What's the process that you need to go through with your employer in order to increase your savings rate? And then actually collect as much data as you can through surveys or through administrative data sets that might be available to actually inform that understanding of the problem. And let's say you find that the process-related hassles are the linchpin issue that's really driving the problem. So people want to save, but they encounter all these hassles along the way. They can't increase their savings rate. So we use data and behavioral science to understand the problem, but then we borrow from the design world. And I would say more of the individuals that work at Ideas 42 are sort of interested on the research side and in the data side than probably in design, and definitely in a big D way, but we try to borrow from the design world to then think about how can we build novel or fresh solutions to solve this problem that we now have a much better understanding of. So the design comes second. I really like something that was said in an earlier panel about people tend to be very solutions oriented. They want to say, what's the vision? What's the way we're going to solve this problem? And they start there. We sometimes take a step back and say, well, actually, do we have the right problem to be focused on? Do we understand it? Have we spoken to the people who are experiencing this problem? And then use the design approaches to solve it once we understand what the drivers are.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about a good way to kind of approach this, because I think what you just said, I mean, we talked a lot, so we had a little bit of a prep call, and we talked a lot about sort of that challenge of always like kind of starting with a well-defined problem, even if it's not a well-defined problem, right? Like you kind of have to create that framework in order to be able to make it a productive process to solve the problem. But I think thinking about, and actually I guess the other piece of it is, I can always answer this from like the lens of like being a designer in the design world, or the lens of our clients. And I think the way that a lot of our clients, kind of deal with that intersection between data, design, and behavior is that they're looking to us to come to them with kind of well-informed research about why the thing that we're going to design for them is going to help them. And that really drives what we do in our projects, but also sort of what we do in parallel to our projects. And Gensler spends a lot of time, and I think well-founded time, developing research that when we are at the table with a client, we can say, yeah, this is actually, the space that we're about to design for you will meet the metrics that matter to you. But that's that takes a lot of work. It's a hard thing to kind of continuously do that and stay up to date with what those metrics really are.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit, Jessica, when you're talking, having kind of design as a phase two. Like, do you all view kind of design, data, and those behavioral sciences as kind of separate things that like are linked together to create a whole? Are they kind of all combined at the same time? Like, how? What does that process look like?
I think so. Our work is pretty pragmatic. Fundamentally, we design digital products and services, and sometimes our clients come to us having already defined the problem they want to solve. Most of the time, they have a problem they could solve, and they want some validation that is the appropriate problem. But in most cases, our projects have a time constraint, and they have a fixed output. There has to be a solution to the problem. So we've always, even before we were really aware of the importance of data, or there was less data out there, we've always understood that it was our responsibility to push our clients to understand how various points of view could inform better solutions. And we're very much in that position right now too. Our projects always start with some form of research for problem definition or problem shaping, so that we can actually identify the problem before we solve. And increasingly, we're being asked to help clients form a strategy around data. Sometimes we have tools to do that. Sometimes we don't have tools to do that. I'm working on a project right now in the utility space, which is incredibly monolithic and conservative. 50 years ago, the people we were designing for would have had slide rules and gone out into the field and actually, measured flow of resources through the system and made decisions on the spot, and then turned a valve wheel to actually stop or start change the behavior of their system. Now it's very, very different. The tools are far more intelligent. They're generating, 4 log messages a second, and there's 6,000 devices on the system, and a problem happens, and now all of a sudden you have to understand the problem, and you also have to respond to sometimes the system's automatic operation. And so we have all these complex issues of control and trust and actually, effectiveness of the solution that all kind of have to come together, and there's not really a way to disentangle the pieces, the design, the data, and the behavior from that kind of problem.
Yeah, I would say actually the more integrated, the better. Sort of as I was mentioning, in a lot of our work, we think about understanding the problem first, and once we have a good understanding of that, then we'll turn to designing solutions and actually building them out. And I'm seeing more and more that there's a lot of demand from the groups that we're working with, and a lot of interest internal to the organization, and of course through exposure to other people who are using design methods to build new solutions, to really have that design process be sort of well defined and refined using data and insights about behavior along the way. So it's not just one large ideation. You know, most people who are here and who have experience in design more than I do will, of course, know this, but you really want to prototype test, usability test, get feedback along the way. And I actually think the availability of data and insights about human behavior and how to use that data to inform your understanding of human response to your design is really powerful in ensuring that you're putting your effort and energy and resources in the right place. So you're taking the design from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 iteratively, and you're using all 3, design, data, and behavior, and understanding of human behavior to do that effectively.
I think just to kind of, I guess, share a specific example, we completed a business school at University of Kansas a few years ago, and when we started the project, this was like in 2013, you know, flipped classrooms and blended learning and like hyper flexible spaces were like so, you know, they were such buzzwords, and they, you know, KU kind of had a typical faculty makeup where, you know, some faculty were super comfortable teaching in, you know, like the typical kind of case study classrooms that are like tiered classrooms, and like they knew if that student was going to sit there that day that they would sit there the following day, and that it really helped them, you know, teach. And there were other faculty who were totally happy to be in like a hyper flexible, maybe not even in a defined space teaching a class. And so you know, for them, they were moving from a building that had a lot of these tiered classrooms and not very many flexible spaces, and they asked us, like, how can you prove to us that our, you know, our student performance, learning, engagement is going to improve if we, you know, kind of fit out this new building with these hyper flexible spaces? And we were like, we can't. But it compelled us to, you know, kind of organize our research around, you know, kind of pre and post occupancy studies of these types of spaces to understand, you know, what was the impact on human behavior. And, you know, we're in the business of design, we're not in the business of education, so we couldn't go as far as to say, you know, yes, we're gonna, you know, the metrics that you have to report out on your assessments to, you know, whatever regulatory or, you know, auditing agency regulates learning environments. But we could say is, you know, student engagement. We understand how we can impact that by space, and we sort of developed a framework, you know, to kind of structure our research around kind of key components that were measurable that would relate back to engagement. And so, you know, I think that has become a methodology where, you know, now if we came to the table again with that same client and they asked us the same question, we could say, yes, you know, we have a way to kind of look at this, but that methodology in and of itself needs to be iterative as well. I mean, I think that goes back to, it's never a perfect methodology, right? Like we're continuing to find new ways to really inform how we're measuring these spaces.
That point of measurability and assessment, using data to drive those processes is a critical challenge for us too. That when we were founded 16 years ago, Moment was deep in the qualitative world, and over the course of, you know, Moment's history, the world around us sort of changed a little bit. People began to, you know, our clients, but everybody saw the value in taking a user-centered approach when it came to product design. They saw that expressed as gross metrics. They understood very well, how many customers do I have, how much money are they spending, kind of metrics. And that was sufficient for a while, and now it's not sufficient anymore. And our understanding of the impact of the choices that we're making as designers needs to be much more nuanced and granular. And it is, for us who are still very much in a qualitative world, territory that we've really been pushing to enter, and you know, it's a place where we need to apply more rigor.
Yeah, I think measurement is a critical issue, and finding something that you can measure that's still meaningful can be a challenge. So, for instance, we have some work in civic engagement, looking at how communities engage with the other residents that they sort of other residents in their neighborhood, whether they participate in town hall meetings, whether they vote. I mean, there's so many aspects of community and civic engagement, right? And people today talk about the crisis of isolation and there's no engagement and people aren't civically engaged and not engaged with their communities. But actually, how do you measure that in a meaningful way? How can you say the design that we've built, the project that we've now initiated had a meaningful impact on civic engagement? You know, oftentimes you just have to rely on what's available and what's relatively inexpensive to access in terms of data. And for us, we've seen that basically the whole world, for the whole world, that means voting, right? Because voting records in the US are public. Whether you voted or not is public record. You can buy those data sets, and you can say a lot about whether something that you did had an impact on someone's propensity to vote or whether they actually voted or not. But you can't say whether something you did actually help them connect with their neighbor or feel a better sense of community or some of the more meaningful things, right, that really are the things that we care about. So I think it's a tension, right? We're always facing this tension in measuring, or do we have data that will provide meaningful information and insight about the behaviors that we really care about? And frequently you don't, and so you need to kind of talk with your partners and other people in the field about what's the best proxy at this point in time. Anyway, so that's something that definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I think that leads into my next question really, really well. You know, with all the integration of the different fields and kind of defining like what do we measure, both intangible and tangible. Like who is up for, who's best suited to kind of like own, you know, the best practices and the kind of the mindset behind like how we approach this.
Well, I guess just to piggyback on something actually that you guys both said, I mean, I think around the methodology, like we sort of like, you know, put our methodology into kind of 3 different buckets. One is, you know, like what's actually happening in a space, and 2 is like what do people think is happening in the space, and then 3, like, why is it happening? And I think that's helped to sort of frame the types of methods that we kind of put into our toolkit and you know, depending on the problem at hand, like what are the methods that we take out from that toolkit and use in that specific instance. And you know, I think the oftentimes, you know, self-reported surveys are like, you know, it's an easy thing to do, right? It's like you know, pretty low fidelity, but also, you know, you can get massive quantities of data, and you don't really have to dig too deep into an organization in order to like pull off a survey. But the problem is that self-reported data, and that's a really valuable thing, but it's not. I mean, I think what we've found is it's kind of, you know, it's a little bit faulty just by nature of what it is. And so I think what we're increasingly trying to do are, you know, trying to find those other methods of what's actually happening, right? And then, and why is it happening? And I think for the most part, why is it happening? You know, usually we're able to kind of perfect our focus groups methodology, whether that's one-on-one interviews, whether it's larger groups together. But what is actually happening in the space is a question that I think it has, like, for us, the most just the most leeway and is just like infinitely expandable, right? And we feel like we've only begun to scratch the surface. You know, certainly with our practice around, you know, observational analysis, using our designers and people within our organization, observing these spaces and using kind of iPad-based apps to, you know, to sort of record what's happening. So there's that sort of like human driven tool, but then also things like sensors in spaces, and then, you know, speaking of proxies, like using things like IT data to use that as a proxy for utilization of space. So I think, again, like we're constantly trying to kind of build on that bucket, because I think it has so much potential, but none of those 3 buckets can function in themselves. I think you've got to sort of like have all 3.
I'm pretty sure for us, or the nature of the projects that we do, it's our responsibility to set the standards for assessment. We're often the ones that are closest to the users and are sort of redefining the problems. You know, that utility project I'm working on, the ultimate goal of the product we're designing is to reduce the interface to nothing. If they didn't have to use it, that would be great. And that's a fundamentally different point of view than the way this problem has been approached previously, and it's one that was coming directly out of you know, customer research. And so it's on us to be able to define the gross metrics, how long is somebody spending on these sites, the obvious ones, but also to find the appropriate proxies to say we have these insights from research that are paired to hypotheses about how people want to use the product and what are the supporting data for those hypotheses.
Since we're a bit closer to the research world, I think there's a gold standard out there, which is the really well-designed and rigorously designed evaluation, the randomized control test, or other kinds of quasi-experimental methods. And for most of the academic affiliates and partners that sort of are producing research, really that's still the gold standard. If you're not producing that kind of research, it's not good enough to go out into a journal, and it's not necessarily something that others will feel comfortable translating into practice. But we're seeing from some of the organizations out there in the world who are doing real work, applying insights from these fields and trying to use data design and insights about human behavior to build something, that there's a lot less patience. You can't wait, you know. First of all, people don't want to spend $500,000 or $1 million to design, or like to build and put out into the field a really well-designed study, and they definitely don't want to wait the 2 or 3 years it will take to set it up, put it out in the field, collect data for 6 to 12 months, which is even short for many longitudinal studies, and then write the manuscripts and put it out there, and then show up at a conference. So people are looking for new methods to measure things on a much shorter time frame and time scale, but still have some rigor. So they're looking at A/B testing, they're looking at optimization, they're looking at matching, propensity score matching methods, other types of new methods, which are really coming mostly from the field, I think, and from many people who work with big data. And they're saying, that's good enough, right? And I really do think that there's some echo here to the point earlier about satisficing, right? Data is built to optimize. You can really ask any question you'd like if you have access to great data, but human beings are trying to make decisions. So if you can meet some level of rigor that your partners care about, that people out there in the world care about, that's going to give them enough information that they feel comfortable moving to the next stage, you've hit the nail on the head. So it's sort of, there's the academia, but there's also in practice, and you want to find, in partnership with the groups you're working with, what is the right level of evidence that we need in order to inform a decision.
I think just a quick add to that. I mean, especially, we often come to projects where, our client expects us to build a space, right? I mean, that's kind of, like, they're like, you're an architect or you're an interior designer, like, I need you to build my space. And because of sort of the nature of our practice, I think even in those, those very kind of straightforward projects where, the client has pretty much gotten their ducks in a row to be ready to design a space rather than sort of figure out what it is they need to have in that space. I think that challenge of having like those really even something that's like super smart in terms of producing results and producing some like data informed approach is really important, because the perception of our clients is that we should be designing their space. We shouldn't be developing like long range studies for them, right? So, I mean, if we had it our way, we would totally do that. But, I think on the flip side, there are some clients who I think are increasingly starting to see how those sort of in-depth studies are informing space and informing environments. And it's almost like you want to be able to kind of shift that lever, based on sort of what the context is of what you're trying to solve and what the client's expectations are.
I think part of the problem, at least for us too, or part of the nature of the context, is that ultimately what we are responsible for doing, especially since we're a consultancy and we're not there forever, is to be very aware that there's an impact of the decisions we're making, and that we are responsible for informing our partners that this decision is based on this supposition, and we have the best data that we have right now to make that. And then if you see a certain behavior, if you see these particular data markers, once the thing actually goes out, we made a bad decision, and you need to reconsider the impact of what we decided. And that can be quite challenging, to expose ourselves to that kind of risk and criticism, and also challenging to our sort of our image of ourselves as experts, that clients hire us because we know how to solve these problems, and we have to be very honest to say, well, we have a framework for solving these sorts of problems, but your problem is sort of we don't know if it's solved until people actually use it.
Do you find that the clients and partners that you have are kind of open to this experimentation, like knowing that you're kind of trying to identify the proxies that you're looking for? Are they kind of in it with you, saying, "Oh, we're not really sure this might work," or are they kind of more to your point, expecting kind of a delivery there?
Well, I think there's definitely a range, but at the previous panel, we talked about, kind of there's raw data and then there are actual insights. And I think one of the things, and this can be like super simple stuff, like taking their like Excel file of their square footage program and like turning it into something visual, and it like blows their mind, right? I mean, there are things like that. But I think there are also, where the more data heavy projects that we've done, we've literally sat in a room with a client where we sort of visualized the data of the use over time of their campus, right, and shown like floor by floor on a big college campus. This is how these buildings are being used, and they could see it, in 3D and really kind of visualize that beyond just kind of a graph. And for them, like, that was incredible, right? Like we were helping them. We were like a translator, right? Like we weren't even necessarily designing anything at that point. We were just translating the data that they already had in place on their campus and helping them see it differently. And I think, that idea of kind of making visible what is typically invisible is a huge platform for us as designers, to be able to kind of help people see things through a new lens, right?
Another kind of topic that I wanted to talk about was this idea of, as these professions kind of evolve and we are involved in them for longer, they have a tendency to get a little bit more specialized over time. And so I just kind of want to get a sense from you all, in your careers or your organizations, is that kind of the trend that you've seen, and how has that kind of affected your organization and how people work together?
I think we actually see the opposite trend. I mean, this is my bias. I was somebody who was a developer, and now I'm a designer. And I wasn't an amazing developer, and I maybe not be an amazing designer, but I'm
sure you're wonderful.
The qualities of both, I think, have made me more effective than I would be if I had only had one discipline or the other. And I think maybe it's a unicorn that we're looking for, but I think that there is an equivalent, at least for us, of somebody who has some sophistication in understanding data, some real sophistication, technical sophistication, but also is motivated by a user-centered point of view. And they may not be the person you want who's just crunching the numbers, and you may not be the person you want who's just doing the user-centered design, but that some discipline between, I would feel pretty confident betting is going to emerge, at least for us, that there's going to be somebody that we're looking for, right? It's somebody we are already looking for.
I think we've seen something a bit different. When the market for behavioral science and sort of interest in behavioral economics and applying those insights to build new products was first emerging, you could probably get away, someone who had some background in psychology, maybe had taken statistics and had some savvy with data, and was sort of had a good visual eye, would be able to get by, right? They really were bringing something new to the field. But I think that there is a need for more expertise, and that doesn't necessarily need to come through specialization, but it often does. So we're seeing now that there's a much greater need for someone who's really great with data. So a data scientist, someone who can really work with large data sets and be able to parse that effectively. Someone who's a real expert in sociology, social psychology, cognitive psychology, to really be able to understand different problems and the behavioral sciences. And then also, designers, really people who really understand how to build something that users want, that has great UX, UI. I think, and we're starting to hire more and more people with those different types of backgrounds into the organization. So we're feeling that pressure to raise the bar, but it would be amazing if there were a unicorn of someone who had great skills in all three. We would hire all. If you have all three, come talk to me after. But we've seen something a bit different, but I agree that having some understanding of all three is really valuable, or at least having teams that are cross-discipline or multidisciplinary.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that we struggle with a lot in our own organization. And I think, I mean, in some ways there are a lot of external factors that are driving expertise, but the real, I mean, I feel like the real kind of operational functionality of like running a team requires that you have the unicorns, like the generalists or the people who are the integrators. And so, I mean, I work for a big organization. Big organizations like to have roles for people. They like to have, you know, their kind of spread of talent. They like to be able to say, like, this is, you know, this is this expert, and we bring this whole constellation of people. And on top of that, I work for clients who, you know, they want to hire the people that they're sure that are going to be able to do the job. And so what's the best indicator for them of that? That's a whole list of like the 50 business schools we've just done, right? So there's, you know, there are a lot of external factors that are driving that expertise piece. On the flip side, and, you know, we see this just in terms of like thinking about learning and thinking about like what are the skills that we're trying to prepare students for in the future when you know, there's a stat that we talked about from the Atlantic that like 65% of kids today will end up in jobs that haven't even been invented yet. So what are the skills that you're trying to teach people, you know, when you don't even know what you're teaching them for? And so I think, you know, I feel like the people in our organization who really thrive are the people who have, I mean, what traditionally have been called soft skills, but are really skills that are hugely necessary. Like if someone had told me in architecture school that like 95% of my job is going to be communication, I feel like I would have approached things differently. So, you know, I think there's a constant vacillation, and, you know, again, in the previous panel, someone talked about majors and minors, and I think you are really good at your major, and that's great, but you're going to be even better if you've got some minors, because it means you've got empathy for everybody who's working around you.
Yeah, that sounds like, so one of my questions that was kind of looming was, is it possible to prepare, right, for the future and what your job is going to be? And I think you spoke to a little bit, right, like a major and minor. Jess and Josh, like, do you agree? Do you think it's something that we can prepare for, the younger generations can prepare for, or how do you see that evolving?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that the major-minor framework makes a lot of sense for us. I mean, I think it could be that, Jess, I think that the nature of the problems you're solving are quite different. I think your problems tend to be more, I would guess, more systems related and more broad and general, where our problems are complex but focused. For us, yeah, it's pretty easy for me to say that there's a point of view of the world that is well represented by, you know, the kind of students that still graduate from ID, and if we add a little bit of the special sauce of data on top of that, it doesn't have to be somebody who is a data scientist. If we add just enough knowledge, technical knowledge, that they're able to tell us what is a potentially good solution, what is a potentially bad solution, that gets us a long way towards solving the kinds of problems that we solve. It allows us to offer a more sophisticated solution so that when we're working with, especially an organization that has deep capabilities in data science, we're not telling them, we're not giving them bad ideas.
The one thing I would add is just, I think it's hard to prepare in a short period of time, you know, in your undergraduate and maybe graduate school years for a lifelong career in sort of this field. So my sense is that you won't be able to, it's not possible to fully prepare because we don't know what's going to come in the future. But the best thing that you can do is develop a sense of intellectual curiosity, want to read a lot, want to talk to people, listen to what other people have to say, try to learn about other projects and things that are going on in the field, and that will probably give you more exposure and I don't know, more opportunity to be successful in learning all the skills or picking them up as you go along. That said, I do think the major-minor framework is a good idea, right? Having some exposure, but just enough to be able to ask smart questions.
Yeah, I think, so I was having a conversation with my 5-year-old daughter a few months ago, and it was the conversation about like, what are the important things in the world? Like, what's important to do? And I was like, be kind, and I had this whole long laundry list of things, and the first thing she said was learning. It's important to learn. And I mean, I think this speaks to your intellectual curiosity, right? Like I think part of it is, helping people learn how to learn and just to keep doing that over and over and over again. Because I feel like, I'm still waiting for the day when I've got it all figured out and I can just coast in my job. Because I feel like that's what I thought it would be like, looking back. But I think learning it's a huge skill, and there's like a certain humility to that and kind of vulnerability to that I think is very human, and that people really respect and kind of recognize.
Great. I'd love to take a moment and kind of open it up to a little bit of Q&A from the audience if people have a couple questions. Gentleman over there, we might have a mic running towards you shortly. There it goes.
Hey, just quickly riff on the intellectual curiosity thing, because I just violently agree with this. I'm coming from the data science paradigm, and the former chief data scientist of the US government, DJ Patel, said that the #1 trait of a good data scientist is intellectual curiosity. And the best data scientists have the kind of associative thinking characteristics of the best scientists in any field. But it kind of ties back to what you guys were saying earlier about measuring the unmeasurable. In my experience, these things fall between the bullet points on resumes. How do you, wouldn't it be great to be able to kind of like figure out how to use digital breadcrumbs or other sources of information to kind of measure what you can't measure now, which is, behavioral traits like intellectual curiosity. And actually,
sounds like a machine learning problem, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it is in a way. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I wish the same thing. I mean, sometimes I get these resumes that like are on paper. They're like, oh, well, checks all the boxes. And then you like meet the person and you're like, well, maybe it's not such a good fit this time, right? Like it would be, I feel like it would be an amazing opportunity to optimize how, just how we as an organization get talent, but then also how learning in organizations prepare talent, right? Like how do you kind of shape that talent? And because it is these really immeasurable skills. I mean, I don't have an answer. I think it's like an absolutely articulate and eloquent point.
I don't have a great answer to this either, but I do think that if you're in the business of problem solving and seeking new ways to do things, you want to look for people who clearly are really interested and obsess about the problem and really trying to understand what the problem is, or questioning assumptions. Like, everyone thinks that this is why this is the problem, but I don't know, I read this other thing and I don't know if I believe that, and what could we do to test this? I mean, that kind of approach, I think if you, in our hiring process, we like to ask people about what they're reading, what's a new idea that they recently came across that they thought was fascinating, why, but just to get a sense of people's like thirst for knowledge and their ability to think about problems in an analytical way, right? Can you break it down? Can you question it? So. Yeah, I don't know how you build that, but I think if you meet someone who's really curious about problems in the world, it sometimes will show.
I think, so this is a little bit of a tangent, and I think this relates, but you guys can. So we're working on a project right now that's like it's kind of a vocation, well, what would have been traditionally called a vocational school, and it has, a lot of different trades, and one of them is automotive manufacturing. And this may seem obvious to most people in the room, but you kind of have like a very specific or kind of prescribed idea of what automotive manufacturing must look like in terms of a space, and then you realize like actually with autonomous vehicles it starts to look a lot more like a clean room than it does a kind of greasy just the neighborhood car mechanic, right? And I think my point in kind of telling that story is that I think what we may have deemed as being like the vocational track or just the track of an auto mechanic is really expanding, and it's requiring that people are able to solve problems, right? To not just kind of do a rote thing or kind of learn a specific amount of expertise. There's a lot around autonomous vehicles that is not yet defined, and so how do you kind of prepare students in a way that is going to help them to understand that actually their critical skill is that ability to problem solve?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. As someone going through a hiring process myself, being able to kind of identify who can even do this is always the biggest challenge. Of you see something on paper and it doesn't always line up with what the true expectations are. We do a little bit of machine learning in my organization on data, but it would be great to do that in determining who is kind of ideal to do these tasks for sure. Any additional questions? Yes, sir. We have in the back. Oh, there it goes. Excellent.
What about the core purpose of the enterprise? Do you think that, when you're talking about greater than the sum of their parts, you're asking actually, when does magic happen in all of this? And I think that the core purpose of the organization, and whether it's a mission-driven one or is it one that's focused on shareholder maximization, has a lot to do with whether the magic happens or not. I'm just wondering from your experiences, your clients, if you have ever been able to witness that.
We have a stumper.
I mean, sure, of course. I mean, I think that, but that problem is also true in other fields, other related fields. It's true in how we work with their development teams. It's true with how we work with their marketing or communications teams. I think that again, I mean, we see our roles as people that have a human-centered perspective and an expectation that we're able to introduce different contexts of thinking to change our own perspective and make sure that we're representing a diverse set of point of views. It's our job to make sure that the sort of business objective is one of those points of views. And in some cases, I think it sort of came up in one of the earlier panels, in some cases that means that we're responsible for saying, well, what the user wants here is opposed to what your mission is. The user does not actually want to reveal this information, does not want to make this purchase right now. And that is an uncomfortable conversation that we find ourselves in from time to time. And we can't honestly say that we're user-centered without being able to accommodate those points of view.
Yeah, I would say the magic happens when you find or develop the elegant solution. And the elegance comes from it being simple and hitting the person at the right moment and at the right time, in the right way. So I took a behavioral science class in my public policy master's program, and my professor used to talk about elegant solutions, and he gave an example of one that I really like and always remember, which was a design to help more students in the cafeteria recycle their plates. And the design was, at the bottom of the plate, there was a message that was printed into the plate that says, "Don't forget to recycle me." Now, why is it elegant? Because it's part of the physical environment, and it appears to you right when you've finished eating. You've cleaned your plate, and now there's this timely reminder to recycle the plate. So sometimes the solutions are very simple, but they're elegant because they really understand the behavioral science. They've been sort of designed really well, and hopefully there's been some use of data to measure the effectiveness.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about kind of the power of design and how it can impact human experience. I mean, that's sort of the core of our business. And I think, speaking from just the education practice, I think regardless of how frustrating and sometimes, just idiosyncratic clients can be, at the end of the day, in education, most of the time they're trying to just make somebody's life better, right? Like they're trying to do a good job. And I think for me, that sort of keeps me coming back every day. But I think where the sort of magic happens and how that kind of connects back, just to share a quick story, we did 826 Chicago, which is it's an organization founded by David Eggers, who's a really well-known author, and it's meant to be an after-school program for kids for creative writing. And so it's like a storefront, and the back of the space is the actual kind of creative writing tutoring center that students can come in, and this is school-age students. But the front is it's a store. and it sells spy gear, like, you know, like literally like just to outfit yourself to look like a spy. And, you know, for us, that sort of meant, you know, that's a really interesting way to kind of draw kids in and kind of pique their intrinsic interest and their passion for something. And of course, it, you know, kind of relates so well to creative writing and, you know, kind of how do you sort of elicit the curiosity out of these kids. And, you know, so I think there are projects like that, and there are many other stories like that where, you know, it's still, you know, we feature that project again and again and again in our marketing, and it's so from our kind of business side of things, it sort of meets those, it like checks off the box for business, but at the same time, I think it's really about, you know, again, improving the human experience with the power of design.
Yeah, Megan, you use quotes around magic, and Jesse, you use elegant solutions. Is it magic, or is it, you know, collaboration? I mean, I personally try to tell my clients, this is not, we're going to work together and we're going to find a solution. Is that a term that you kind of embrace or avoid?
Yeah, I mean, we use partner a lot. I mean, very, like we're like working alongside our clients, and yeah, I mean, I think we very much are not of the ethos of like, hey, we're this, you know, kind of magical unicorn designer that comes in and solves the world's problems in this like vacuum. You know, I think that's not.
We have about 2 minutes. Maybe one quick question, if there's one looming in the audience. Yes, sir.
So I want to ask about magic. Yeah. So your thoughts. Sometimes you're solving a problem, like you know what behavior you want, and sometimes I think like your hyper-flexible spaces, you're really enabling new behaviors that maybe people didn't know they wanted. I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little on that, and especially the use of data and how that plays in, or how you've used that before.
Well, I think one thing that we talk a lot about is, because we, especially, you know, in learning environments, but also like innovation centers, is kind of that, you know, that idea of manufacturing innovation. Like, how do you kind of like put into place those ingredients or kind of core elements of a space that kind of draw people together, that is, you know, maybe initially like a sticky space that like brings people in, makes them stay, and oh, by the way, they end up talking, and like what happens, right? So there's sort of like those fundamental pieces that, you know, I think in a lot of the spaces that we design, it's not, you know, trying to prescribe those activities that people do, but also not offering such a hyper flexible space that like no one knows what to do with it, and so they're not sure how to personalize it, they're not sure how to own it, and so I think that's kind of typically our approach, is sort of understanding how do you kind of put into place an environment that people can work with, but there are cues that sort of help them understand how they might relate to it. Maybe you guys can speak to the data piece of that. I mean, I think I can go on and on about, like, we do post-occupancy. One of the things that we did at 1871 actually was, you know, we thought initially that this is a super simple example, but we thought initially they wanted to have like lounge furniture in a bunch of these spaces, and we ended up purchasing like 75% of the furniture, because we kind of wanted to do a little bit of a test with the other 25%, and it actually turned out that most people wanted to have like tables and chairs, because that's, you know, so where we would have maybe spent a bunch of money on lounge furniture, it ended up being, you know, tables and chairs, and that was the thing that really drew people, and now they're totally full. So, I mean, it's simple stuff like that too, where, you know, you don't know how a space is going to be used until you actually see how it's used.
That's actually all the time that we have. So thank you so much to our three panelists for this. And you guys, I think, are going to head to lunch next.